These true disturbing police horror stories can agitate your mind and give you chills instantly. Being a police officer can be terrifying owing to the continual exposure to potentially deadly situations and unforeseen contacts. So join us as we ride through my story's incredible and horror journey. Story 1. The Internet Killer. For the past 5 months, there has been a widespread circulation of information regarding a popular Facebook killer over the internet. Because of this, it has even attracted the attention of several international media outlets, and this situation is rapidly becoming out of control. In February, a new Facebook account was created in Germany. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical description of someone named SKO. On the other hand, rather quickly, the user began posting photographs of the dead bodies of those whom he had murdered. Because the user tagged all of the victims' friends and family members, we were able to learn about the person who was responsible for the murder on Facebook. I am a police officer. Therefore, I immediately began working on the case from the very beginning. When the initial complaint was lodged at our police station, I was assigned to manage the case. However, since that day till today, the Facebook murderer has been responsible for the deaths of 7 individuals and has posted about each murder on his Facebook account. We, as police officers, had to swing into action immediately. Apparently, this event took place during the early, beautiful days of Facebook, when the platform had only begun to acquire popularity. It was difficult for the digital forensics department to pinpoint the whereabouts of the person responsible for the crime. On a certain evening, I was simply sitting at my desk at the police station, completing some paperwork by myself. Most of the officers had gone home, and the station was deserted. During that period, I was just 29 years old and not in a relationship, so I was completely taken aback when a lovely woman entered the police station and sat opposite my desk. She had dark brown eyes, gorgeous blonde hair, and a beautiful body. Her eyebrows were dark brown. On the other hand, she came in crying, which was surprising to me. "May I be of assistance to you, ma'am? Please tell me what happened and why you are crying," I asked her. The protective instincts that are innate to me kicked in. The young lady uttered these words as tears streamed down her eyes. "I need to be arrested right now." "Ma'am, I would appreciate it if you could explain what happened and why I should put you under custody." "Because I am unable to control myself," she said. While this was going on, she continued to sob uncontrollably. It was now becoming annoying to me. What is it that you can't control doing? Each passing minute brought about an increase in the level of confusion over this matter. "It is necessary that you put me in jail because I have killed my mother, our driver, and the gardener. I am unable to stop myself from killing, and I have a tremendous want to kill. Please assist me, detective." At my workstation, she pleaded with me and cried out in pain. Shockingly, I was completely taken aback. What was I expected to do? At that particular time, I was the only person present, and a few officers too. Nevertheless, I was having a hard time believing that this was what it was. It is difficult to comprehend why someone would turn themselves in after committing a murder, let alone urge a detective to put them in jail. It's possible that this woman was mentally unstable and needed help. "You claim that you were responsible for the deaths of 3 persons, madam. Can you please tell me where you kept the dead bodies, for us to verify their death and move on with your arrest?" We had to examine the bodies of the deceased to determine whether or not she was lying, or whether she was a mentally sick person. She appeared to comprehend the situation. Nevertheless, if she was suffering from mental illness, she might be faking the death. "Okay, officer, they are all in my compound. So, can you lead the way to your house?" I inquired of her with as much patience and diligence as I could muster. As a detective, I have gained sufficient knowledge about how to deal with situations like these. After crying for a time, she finally responded, "Of course, officer." I was aware that it would be important to bring a few police officers along with me, so I contacted Clement and Anthony to accompany me to the woman's residence. After a few minutes, we got to the front of a large mansion on the town's outskirts. "Do you live in this house?" As I asked the woman sitting next to me, I noticed she had not yet stopped sobbing, which was very annoying. How can you kill someone and still cry about it? After exiting the vehicle, the 4 of us entered the property. Could you please tell me where the bodies are, ma'am? I asked her. I buried the gardener and the driver in the backyard, she said. And then she began heading toward what I presumed to be the backyard. During this time, Clement, Anthony, and I followed her trail and eventually stopped in front of two large pits that measured around 6 feet in length and 4 feet in width. Although the pits were covered in mud, it was clear to anyone who looked closely that these were not typical mud patches. Rather, these were unmarked graves. Nevertheless, she confirmed that the bodies are located in that area. Where is the body of your mother? As soon as I mentioned her mother, the woman began crying more loudly than before. She did, in fact, kill her mother, and she now feels guilt for her actions. Anyway, I needed to locate a dead body and then contact for assistance. Please come with me, officer, and I will show you where her body is. After following the woman, climbing 2 steps in the mansion, she abruptly stopped and pointed a shaking finger toward a room at the end of the hallway. I followed her into the room immediately. I approached the room with caution and opened the door before heading inside. I couldn't find any dead bodies in the room because it was well decorated but had a low, dim light. Although I entered the room, I was still unable to locate the deceased person's body. That is when I noticed another door in one of the corners. It must have been the door to the bathroom, and that had to be the place where the deceased person was lying. As I entered the room, I felt a sharp pain in my back. It was a knife pressed directly into me. I was unable to comprehend what was taking place. My attention was no longer focused on anything happening outside the room because everything happened so fast. Oh, what's going on? Was this a trap? Did this woman set us up? I asked no one in particular. My hands could not reach the knife, and I could only hear her high-pitched laughter. I got you before you could catch me, detective. I was able to make it out of the bathroom and into the main room, but all I could do was manage to get out of there. She was smiling and laughing and wasn't crying as she had been earlier. I was told that you were looking for the Facebook killer, and I was under the impression that you were investigating my case. However, you are just an unfortunate and weak detective who wasn't quick enough. It's a safe guess that you didn't anticipate the murderer as a female. As you can see, there is no gardener, no driver out there, and no dead body in the room. I merely wanted you to be by yourself, so that I could ultimately kill the detective himself. He was following my trail like a puppy trained to obey, but it turns out that you are not very good at your job after all. I couldn't believe what I was seeing or hearing, so she was the internet's killer herself. And right now, I will be her next victim. I pictured her posting a picture of me online, claiming I was a weak police officer. I imagined how she would react, see how she trapped me to come to her house smartly without stress. On the other hand, I tried to persuade myself that it was not my fault either. Where was I supposed to go with this? An investigation was brought to my attention, and I was required to examine the deceased before the arrest. As I lay there on the floor with my face on the ground, I could faintly hear her babbling on and on about how she had me and how she was smarter than me. I began to bleed out, and I was aware that if I did not take any action, I would pass away. I was aware that my men down there would be unable to hear me scream or help me out, and I also knew that the backup squad would not arrive in time. Knowing fully well that I was still going to die, I decided to ask her a question that had been bothering me ever since I began working on this case. Why did you kill all those people? And why do you want me dead as well? Oh, detective, you don't understand. It's just so joyful to take someone's life. It's incredible to watch how my victims beg for my mercy, having their death in my hands. And you should know that it's a lot of fun to watch you pass away right now. After that, she laughed and then just sat in a chair, staring at me and watching me die slowly. Right at that moment, as I was taking my last breath, I pressed the panic button on my mobile phone, and a few seconds later, I passed out. A couple of weeks later, I found myself awake in a hospital, and I had no idea how I was saved or who saved me. What if it had been worse? For example, what would have been the news? A detective who was working on the investigation of a murderer on the internet and was murdered by the same person he was investigating. I was extremely fortunate to have escaped death while I was at the peak of my life. Although this is a terrifying and dangerous job, We have taken an oath to safeguard the lives of every person, even if it means doing so at our own expense. As far as I was aware, the Facebook killer had been arrested, and I was still alive to tell the story of how I came dangerously close to losing my life at the hands of a serial killer while on duty. Story 2. An old woman's ritual. The next story will thrill and terrify you, so pay attention and grab some popcorn. A lady named Ella called the emergency number 911 and stated that someone had broken into her home. On that particular day, I was the one who answered the phone call because I was on duty. Along with a few other police officers, I went to the location to inspect and examine it inch by inch, but we couldn't find anything. We came up to nothing. Typically, this is something that might be simply explained. The mind of an elderly person who lives alone will ultimately begin to deteriorate with the advent of dementia, and other mental difficulties will begin to take a toll on their lives. It is truly quite terrible. In spite of this, the woman in question is only 26 years old. To put it another way, the likelihood of all of this occurring inside her head is exceedingly remote. In addition to that, she appeared to be deeply terrified by the entirety of the event. What is the reason behind her acting? Eventually, my colleague and I left her place, and we instructed her to contact us if she noticed anything else in the future. At that point in time, I was completely helpless. The following day, I received another call from her, which was a complete surprise to me. I traveled down there and conducted another check of the house, but I could not locate anything. However, I did observe one issue. The house appeared to be different this time, almost as if there were some tiny elements that made it a little different from the one we saw previously. On the other hand, my partner Vince stated that he discovered it as well, but he was unable to fully comprehend what was wrong. We concluded that we had nothing to say on this matter, and we told Ella that we had nothing to provide. Despite this, she instructed us to wait. She stated that she had recorded him. Then, she pulled out her phone and told us to watch the clip she had filmed earlier. Apparently, it was a tape of her inside the house. She was furiously running around and breathing heavily. And then we saw him, a large person dressed from head to toe in what appeared to be a black bodysuit. While Ella was screaming, she lumbered toward the camera and then banged into a room, locking it from the inside. After hearing a few loud bangs on the door, we finally heard footsteps walking away from the building. Despite being lost for words, we decided to give this footage a shot regardless. After Ella had disappeared behind the door, we concluded that the man must have left. On the other hand, when we arrived, the front door was closed, and Ella informed us that she had not yet left the room. Was he also in possession of the keys to her home? This would explain a lot, but also make the situation much more difficult. I carefully parked my car in an unmarked spot about a block away from the house because my partner and I had decided to keep an eye on her residence for the night. At this point, both of us are completely awake and prepared to go as soon as we spot a shadowy figure. Around 2 in the morning, we noticed someone walking across the road in the direction of her residence. However, it wasn't the man, it was Ella herself. I believe that Vince and I had the identical expression on our faces at the time. I can't believe it. We jumped out of the car and made our way over to the location, where we pushed on the front door with a great deal of force. We were able to observe lights flickering on and off intermittently, but we were unsure of what this indicated. Does she intend for us to leave the premises? We received a call from dispatch a few moments later. They informed us that Ella had called 911 again, stating that there were now many people in her house. They asked if we needed backups, and we responded positively. There was not a single second of hesitation on our part before we pushed open the door and stumbled inside. Although the lights in the living room continued to flicker on and off, we were able to observe the light switch and observe that no one was touching it. We called on Ella, but nobody answered. It was actually rather calm throughout the entire location. In response to the commotion, I could see the lights in the houses that were adjacent to the one we were beginning to turn on. We hurried up the stairs and began searching each room, but nothing was found. Once more, we inspected the location in minute detail, but we were unable to find anything inside, not even Ella, whom we recognized as having entered the room just a few moments before. As I wandered around in a state of scared perplexity, Vince made an observation. This location has rooms that should not be there." "What exactly are you talking about?" I asked him. According to him, I have been counting. On our first visit to this house, there were a total of 9. Nevertheless, there are now 10. You failed to notice this change. Although I was aware that something was odd, I could not identify exactly what it was. I forced myself to think deeply and subconsciously. On the other hand, I eventually became aware of the basement. The previous time I went down there, there was just one door, but now there are 2 doors. Regarding my thoughts, I was at a loss. While I was looking around, I attempted to make an evaluation, but I was unable to come up with any conclusions. After around 10 seconds, we heard a knock on the door, and it sounded like someone was upset. When we looked out the windows of the living room, we were extremely dismayed to see that the red and blue police lights were not present. It goes without saying that we are hesitant to respond. I decided to move ahead, but Vince pulled me back. When he looked at me, he shook his head and whispered, "Remember, we left the door open." And he was right. The sound of another call from dispatch began to crackle on my radio transmitter. Apparently, they informed us that we had to leave the house immediately, and that Ella had contacted them once more, stating in a monotone voice that we were going to die. However, we heard footsteps in the basement. It seemed as though there was someone or something in the basement with us. Fear gradually took hold of us, and the dying call just served to make the situation even more dire. We concluded that it was enough. We needed to leave immediately. As we began to make our way down the stairs, we heard voices emanating from the kitchen. Ella emerged from the kitchen, obstructing our way to the entrance. Her eyes were beady and dull, and she appeared disinterested as she stared directly at us. "Have you been able to locate him?" Not a single trace of emotion could be heard in her tone of voice as she asked. "The basement is a possible location for him. Why don't you go check on him?" Vince and I remained motionless in amazement. She simply continued to look at us, occasionally pointing in the direction of the door leading to the basement. It seemed as though the footsteps that were coming from that direction were going in circles now. We quickly disregarded her request, brushed past her, and dashed out of the front door. The backup that we had dispatched was still not present. So, we decided to simply get into our vehicle. However, someone was walking down the street looking through the window of our driver's side vehicle. He was quite huge and wore what appeared to be a black full-body suit, giving his appearance an odd look. He turned his gaze away from the window and looked at us in the face. His description of his face made it difficult to determine whether or not the suit had any eye holes, but it appeared to be without any. Vince became apprehensive. "I would ask that you get away from the vehicle, sir." He was clearly afraid because his voice breaks in the middle of the sentence. As soon as Vince ceased his conversation, the creature began to make its way towards us immediately. In fact, it was much too quick. During the time that it took us to collect our gun, we became aware that he had actually walked past us and entered the home from the opposite direction. We could not afford to spend any more time, so we hurriedly entered the vehicle, secured the doors, and waited for the backup to come. When the backup finally came, we were subjected to a variety of questions. The house was searched by the squad while they were conducting a few questions, and the team looked like a SWAT. On the other hand, it was not the chief of police who was asking the questions. Rather, it was a man dressed in a suit whom we had never seen before. We were asked how many doors there were in the house, as well as what Ella's appearance was like, and did we ever come across a man who could only see with one eye? We responded to almost all of them, in a manner that was inconclusive, and we were clueless about what was going on. At one point in time, we witnessed members of the SWAT team dragging many stretchers outside and loading them within their trucks. Now, this is not an ambulance. Rather, it is their very own truck. We were eventually questioned by the officer, who instructed us to return to our residence and report to our station as usual. Despite the fact that he instructed us not to be concerned about what we have witnessed here, I'm not sure how he expects us to behave in that manner. As we made our way back to the station, the atmosphere was calm. Vince finally lets out a sigh as we pull into the parking lot. Oh my goodness, Jack is utterly insane. The look on my face conveyed my uncertainty. How did you come to make that statement? Just who is this Jack, anyway? He gives me the same look, indicating that he is equally perplexed and staring at me. What the heck are you talking about? That guy who is the owner of the house. What is it? I responded, perplexed. It was a woman named Ella. How could you have forgotten about her so quickly? We hold each other's tumultuous gaze for what feels like a minute, but we say nothing further. Both of us quietly exited the truck and began walking in separate directions toward our respective homes. Despite the fact that I was aware that there was a grave problem, I was unable to identify what it was. I made an effort to keep my thoughts from wandering too much as my head touched the pillow, and I was able to fall asleep almost 4 hours later. However, I was jolted awake by the phone call shortly after I fell asleep. My hardly comprehensible response is as follows. We need you. A woman who dialed 911 reports that someone is in her house. I felt a tiny sinking in my chest, and it went down entirely when he told me the address, which was Ella. I hang up the phone and collapse into bed. All I want is for this nightmare to end, but I don't believe it will ever end until something is done about it. I just want it to stop. Immediately, I decided to put an end to this insanity and the ridiculous games that Ella was attempting to play. To get to the police station, I got out of bed, dressed myself, and headed there. I was taken aback as I came face to face with Vince, who had been waiting for me. Oh my goodness, this makes things much simpler for me. I informed our chief officer everything that we had accounted for that night, and we came dangerously close to dying at the hands of the young lady. I told him that the house was full of mystery, and Vince confirmed that it was true as well. As soon as we received an old file, we immediately began to investigate Ella and the building in general. Supposedly, Ella had been using fictitious phone calls to get law enforcement officers to come to her flat. To add insult to injury, she murdered them and then performed a ritual in which she used each of their body parts to rejuvenate her appearance and age. It would appear that everything about her was all lies. She was 97 years old, but she appeared to be much younger due to her consistent ritual. Of all the people in this world, she chose police officers as prey. Eventually, she was arrested and jailed. What would a 97-year-old woman do in prison anyway? A few months later, she died because she couldn't renew her sacrifice. I guess you can't cheat nature, though. That was how Vince and I were saved from death in our Call of Duty. Now, do you still want to be a police officer? Well, before you answer that, please click that subscribe button to Top Scares, where we bring you intriguing stories that will scare and blow your minds. You can share, and comment on this video. Let us know what you think. Story 3. The Sudden Disappearance. When my best buddy went missing 15 years ago, I was sentenced to jail for my role in the event. Immediately after everything occurred, I attempted to describe in detail how everything transpired, but no one believed me. Over time, I gave in to the pressure exerted by my interrogators and admitted to their account of the events. I also entered a plea of not guilty to the allegations that were brought against me. Despite the fact that the life I used to have is no longer a reality, despite the fact that I am finally free, I am finally able to tell the truth about what happened. His name was Collins, and we had spent our entire lives together. Neither of us was unfamiliar with criminal activity. Although we have never committed a robbery or a murder, we did engage in a variety of activities, most of which were of a minor kind. To tell you the truth, we didn't do any of it because we were required to. Both of us came from relatively wealthy households, and we simply found it enjoyable to break the rules occasionally. One of the activities that we particularly enjoyed doing together was breaking into construction projects that were located in buildings that had been abandoned. With that, we gained some self-assurance, and we never got caught engaging in any of those activities. It was not until we broke into the office of the police station that had been abandoned. Down the road from the old station, which had been constructed in the 1940s and had already been outgrown by the population of the town many years before, the police department had just finished erecting a brand new station and a mall. Both of these developments were located in close proximity to each other. That meant that there was a structure that was 60 years old, and had a great deal of a terrible history, but it was not completely vacant. It was impossible for Collins and I to avoid going there because he had purchased a fake Polaroid camera to take some eerie photographs and was wearing empty backpacks to collect souvenirs. We were able to enter because the fence was topped with barbed wire, which allowed us to cut the chain at the gate and enter without any difficulty. Following that, we broke the locks on the front door, which had no alarms installed. Almost immediately, we were like a group of children who were inside an illegal candy store. While we were searching for abandoned weapons at the armory, we were only able to uncover several billy clubs. We also broke into the sheriff's office and went through the old papers that were kept in the booking station. After that, we discovered the cells of the jail. There were 4 of them arranged in a row along one wall, and they were adorned with traditional steel bars. Furthermore, the keys to the cells were simply hung on a hook on the wall located on the opposite side of the room. When we started thinking of all we could do with the space, Collins and I started laughing heartily like we were in elementary school. We concluded that we would play a game of cop and criminal, in which one of us would pretend to be a piggish deputy and lock the other participant up in the cell. On the other hand, we challenged each other to a game called rock, paper, scissors to determine who would come out on top. Since I emerged as the winner, it was only natural that I would want to play the role of the police officer. As soon as I started playing the role, I gave the criminal, Collins, who was acting as if handcuffs restrained him, the command to enter his cell. I then locked the gate with the keys and closed it behind him. Although I could tell that Collins was a bit concerned that I might purposefully leave him in there, he made an effort to conceal his anxiety and continued to keep the humor going all the while. Despite the fact that I wanted to toy with him, I urged him to have fun riding, and then I walked away. However, I knew he trusted me because we had been friends for our entire lives. I proceeded to the sheriff's office with my feet placed up on the desk. You know that feeling you get when you have the authoritative power to do anything, right? A little while later, Collins started shrieking like a jailbird. "You had better let me out, you filthy pig," he said. "I really need to get out of here." The sound of his voice echoed across the ceiling of the halls. I yelled back at him, "Shut up, you waste of flesh. You'll get out when you can pay your bill," in response to his words. Collins grumbled, "You didn't give me any bail, you bastard," while doing so with a hint of a chuckle. "I am aware of this since your money was stolen. I know that. When I thought about myself after that, I couldn't help but smile. You are unable to provide evidence that it was not the case." After that, Collins remained silent for a little period of time, but suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, he broke his silence. "I'm damn serious now. I think you gotta let me. I can't stand it any longer in this place, so please let me out." I was taken aback by the tone of his speech, which caused a shudder to run down my spine. I was aware that he was being very serious. Consequently, I jumped up from the desk and hurried down the hall in an attempt to open the cell and get him out. However, when I arrived at the cell, he was already gone. The door to the cell was still closed, but Collins was no longer there. I started to feel stressed out, so I opened it up and walked inside to check if he was hiding beneath the bed. However, I was unable to locate him anywhere in the room. Then I shouted his name, "Collins, where are you?" In response, there was not a single sound that could be heard, with the exception of the reverberation of my own voice, followed by the sound of the door closing behind me. I hurried to the door in an attempt to prevent it from shutting on me, and in the nick of time, I managed to maneuver my hand into the path of the door, which resulted in the door crushing my wrist. I let out a scream of agony, and then I pulled the door open. However, for some reason, it felt like someone was trying to shut the door against me and battling with me. I felt a great deal of fear when I was eventually able to escape. In fact, I did not even bother to look for Collins. However, Collins never showed up there, despite the fact that we had always agreed that in the event that something went wrong, we would take care of ourselves and meet up later. After waiting for several days and weeks, my best friend did not appear. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. I was pinned for it, and even though I am aware that I am not responsible for his sudden disappearance, I have always believed that there is no one else on this planet of existence who should have taken the blame for his disappearance. Meanwhile, the police investigation of his disappearance led directly to me, and from there you can already tell where the story is going. The same thing that got him almost got me as well. There are times when I wish it had happened. We walked to the abandoned police station together, and I locked him up. This was the method by which I was arrested and placed in jail. There was no proof to support my criminal charges. Now, it was my turn, but this time, it was reality that I was dealing with. At that very moment, I solemnly vowed to never again go near or interact with any police officer, their building, or any of their equipment. My best friend and my freedom were taken away from me as a result of that one unique act of having fun. Though I had to pay for something I knew nothing about, I would still serve my punishment in jail, and when I am back, I will spend the rest of my life alone, without any friends. I miss my friend. I miss Collins. Story 4, The Strange Masked Man. I was at the end of my rope a few months ago, and now I'm kind of clutching to the edge of the cliff with one fingernail that is covered in blood. That's just a parable, though, but something strange happened to me. It never occurred to me that you might be barred from calling 911. I have made 31 calls over the course of 36 nights, and I am aware of the truth now. They informed me that the next time they responded, they would arrest me on the spot at home, straight from the jail. And you know what? They would do this if I gave them fake calls again when it was not an emergency situation. If I'm being completely honest, that doesn't seem like an awful idea right now, with the exception of the fact that I would most likely end up losing my children. In the same way I said earlier, this began 36 nights ago. My ex-husband was taking care of the children for the weekend, and I was looking forward to spending some time alone, drinking red wine, and watching something stupid on Netflix. When I peered out the window, I believed I saw something out in my yard. A person. I was pouring out my wine in the kitchen, and I thought I saw it. Since it was dark outside, I hurriedly went to the light switch and turned it upward. When the light from the outside was turned on, it shone all over the yard. There is nothing there. After shrugging it off, I went down on my couch and began scrolling through the various options that Netflix has to offer. Suddenly, the front door began to rattle, drawing my attention. I sat there frozen for several minutes after the rattling stopped, but then the doorbell rang, making the sound like a dagger into the silence. I spilled some wine. It was probably Liam, who merely forgot something for the kids and forgot that I changed the lock. In any case, I got up to look through the peephole at the door. Sure enough, there was somebody there. But it wasn't Liam. At least that's what I thought it was. It was a man who was dressed in full black, including a ski mask that was also black. While I was observing him, he reached down and grasped the doorknob, and then he began playing with the door again. That was when I made my first call to 911. It was the first time. On each and every night, I have seen that man. I only made 31 calls to 911 instead of 36, because the police were stationed right outside of where I was sleeping for 4 of those nights. This was the only reason I made those calls. I was instructed to flick the lights 4 times in order to alert the authorities whenever I saw him. However, despite the fact that I had seen that man for 36 consecutive nights, the authorities did not see him once. Not after I installed cameras all around the home, not after I installed all of the cameras inside the house and also pointed the camera at my backyard. They never saw him, but I did. Every night, sometimes hidden in the darkness, sometimes standing inches away from me, inhaling deeply and exhaling simultaneously. I would tell you what happened to me one calm night. During the night, I couldn't comprehend the level of fear that I was experiencing. This was, without a doubt, the worst night spent alone, but the longer this continues, the more each night gets worse than the one before it. This occurred a little more than a week ago, perhaps 12 days ago. My initial reaction was one of a guarded sense of relief. All of the cameras were set up around the boundaries of the residence, and the police officers were stationed outside. Even if they were unsuccessful in capturing this weirdo, the cameras would at least provide evidence that he did exist, and possibly provide some clues as to who he was. If and when this weirdo showed up, they would capture him. After putting the children to bed, I allowed myself a glass of wine to help alleviate the lingering fear that I was experiencing. By the time I was ready to go to bed, I had reached a point where I was relatively calm and convinced that I was secure for the very first time since this whole thing began. I was desperate for a decent night's sleep, and I fell asleep almost as soon as I got into bed. In the later hours of the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of the floorboards creaking in the area at the base of my bed. Although I was perplexed for a fraction of a second by the half-hangover haze, I eventually realized that another person was in the room with me. I had a gun in the room, but I kept it in a lockbox at the top of my closet where the children couldn't get to it. It was useless to me at that moment. I couldn't believe he was able to get away from the police. Upon hearing the sound of another foot hitting the ground with a gentle thud, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief nearly bursting out of my chest. "Mommy?" I heard. I froze. It was Tyrone, my child, who was 5 years old. I sat up and patted the bed a few times before saying, "Come on." He decided to spend the night with me in my room, since he was typically startled by the weird sounds he heard. This had become a regular routine for him as he loved staying with me. My young child mentioned to me in a completely innocent manner, "Mommy, there is a man in my room, and he wants to see you." While I was racing to the closet to get the gun, I sprinted out of my room and yelled, "Stay here!" According to Tyrone, he was kind to me, and he also gave us candy. Sharon was still hiding out there. Oh my God. My hand was trembling as it held the gun that was inside the box. Would it be appropriate for me to bring a loaded gun into a room where my 7-year-old child was? While I was hiding Tyrone in my room, I got out the gun and ran down the hall. I had no idea what the answer was, but I felt compelled to do so. A man was sitting on the bed with Sharon when I arrived. A smile was on her face as she munched on a candy bar. As she told her mother, "Mr. Knight was incredible." "Why did you never tell us about him?" she questioned me. It was seen that the man was concealing a knife behind Sharon's back. For my own protection, I concealed the gun at my back as well. "What do you really want?" I asked the stranger. Then, for the very first time, I was able to hear the man speak. The modulation of his voice was constantly shifting in an agitated manner, resulting in a range of pitches that ranged from extremely high to extremely low. He stated, "I want what any man wants, and that is your devotion, your gun, and that's all. If you did not give me your devotion, you would be forced to watch your children vanish forever." The hand that was clutching the gun was dripping with sweat, and my stomach was in knots as my heart beat away in a primordial terror I had never experienced before. Sharon innocently asked, "Mom, you have a gun?" The only thing I could do was stand there and gaze at both my daughter and the man. I had no idea what to do either. Moreover, what happens if I hand it over to you? "I will leave for the time being after I have it," the man answered. "There's no point in making a fuss with those officers that are located down there." I was both perplexed and afraid as I handed the gun to him. "Good girl," he remarked. He then switched his attention to Sharon and dropped the knife. "Girlie, Mr. Knight needs to leave right away because there are a lot of other children who need candy. Please behave yourself, and we will see each other again in a little while." Sharon happily replied, "Yeah, I'd be pretty good." The man got to his feet and made his way to the window that was open. I knew I locked the window, but how did he open it? During that time, I grabbed Sharon and ran back into my room while he emerged from the roof of the garage. Immediately I got inside the room, I signaled the police, blinking the lights off and on 4 times. But by the time they arrived inside and went upstairs, the man had already fled. The night before that was the last one I spent with my children. I never saw them at night, but I did see them during the day. It would appear that the man is solely interested in me and not in them. Due to the fact that he was wearing a mask, I was unable to determine who this individual may be. My curiosity in the person hiding behind the mask continued even after I had ensured the children's safety in my room. The idea to look out my window came to me all of a sudden, and I went ahead and started looking. During the night patrol, there were 4 police officers stationed outside of my building, but when I checked, I only noticed 3 of them. I used my eyes to scan and searched all around the police car that was parked outside through my window, but I couldn't find anything. It was like someone had a nightmare. My search for the fourth man was fruitless. I walked out of my room, approached the officers, and wanted to see the officer who had been with them. They were just as surprised as I was, and they had no idea how the young man managed to get away from them. A few minutes ago, I told them everything that had occurred, including how I came dangerously close to losing my child as a result of their recklessness. Now, they believe everything that I have been saying, and it feels good with a sense of satisfaction to know that you are not simply hallucinating or dreaming things. The weird police officer disappeared in this manner, and he never appeared again in his entire life. Story 5, The Mysterious Camera. This event took place during the height of summer in 2019. At that time, I had been serving as an officer for 3 years, and I was doing a pretty decent job at my work. You remember the time when everything was going so well in your life, and your girlfriend just popped the question to you on the same day that you were going to propose to her. That was the case here. What more could I possibly ask for again, when everything is just rosy, or so I thought? To put it mildly, it was exceptional in every way. What happened on that night, however, a night that would continue to torment me for the rest of my life. It was the month of March in 2019. My new partner and I, who I will refer to as Josh, were patrolling Blackwood Street when we received a call from dispatch stating that there was domestic violence distress coming from the neighborhood that we were in. It was an opportunity to demonstrate to the novice how the professionals did it, so I decided to take advantage of it and go check it out. While we were driving to the house, I saw that the residences on the street were extremely quiet and appeared to be abandoned altogether. In spite of the fact that it appeared as though nobody resided in this neighborhood, I didn't pay any attention to it. Almost immediately, we arrived at the residence from which we had received the call, and we parked the vehicle in front of the location where we were going. The house appeared to be quite uncomplicated and consisted of 2-story buildings. After Josh had followed me out of the car, I opened the door and walked out of the car after him. After climbing the stairs leading to the porch, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar as soon as I got there. Then I pulled out my gun and gave Josh the signal to arm himself. After coming to the conclusion that entering the building from the front would have been a poor choice, I went out through the back door to check, only to discover that the back door was also open. I followed Josh inside in a calm manner, and all of a sudden, Josh screamed out to see whether there was anyone else inside. Despite the fact that I struck him in the head when he did that, it appeared as though we were all by ourselves in the house. There was a carpet placed in the middle of the hall, and a few sofas were placed around it. Aside from the fact that it was completely generic, the entire hall did not have a lot of different details. I decided to ascend the steps, and Josh followed me while keeping his gun in a similarly tight grip and keeping it close to him. What do you expect, considering that he was a newcomer to the system? We stepped inside when I noticed that there were 3 rooms in the small corridor that were all open. I observed this as I approached the end of the hall. There were manuscripts on the table, and there were notes scribbled all over the wall depicting ideas for novels. The room had a decent amount of lighting. I was under the impression that this house, or more specifically this room, was the residence of a young writer who was just starting out. During the time that I was picking up the manuscript and beginning to read it, Josh looked around the room. As far as I can tell, the manuscript stated that it was about a woman who lived during the Victorian era and was horribly murdered. Josh had drifted off to the second room, which was the room that was adjacent to the one that I was in while I was reading the brief manuscript with him. After he entered the room, he called out to me, and I put the manuscript down and went to meet with him. My gaze wandered to the room as I became increasingly perplexed. There was a chamber that appeared to be from the Victorian era. It was possible that the author was putting together a role play for that story, but I really don't know, and I couldn't tell either. However, I stepped inside anyhow, and it was convincing. The furniture almost appeared like it had been kept from the Victorian era, and it was almost exactly like the furniture from that era. In spite of this, I left the room in order to investigate the final room that was closed during the night. As Josh pulled out his weapon, I opened it up, getting ready for the worst possible outcome. It was impossible for us to take any chances because, after all, we were in a place that we did not know. And when the door opened, all we could see was darkness. The darkness seemed to have filled the chamber, which appeared to have been broken. Considering that there were no lights in the sockets for the bulbs, it appeared as though there was no power in the room entirely. Nevertheless, it was completely broken. Perhaps it was being remade at the time. My friend Josh and I went into the room and found nothing out of the norm. We only found a few paint buckets and brushes. There was nothing else that stood out. As we exited the room, we made sure to shut the door behind us before leaving. When I entered the first chamber, I discovered that there had been a shift in the environment. It was a Polaroid camera that was sitting on the bed. I looked at Josh and asked, "Was this camera here before?" I might have missed a detail or two in the room, but he replied by shaking his head in a manner that indicated he was unaware of what I had said. The Polaroid caught my attention, and as soon as I took it up, it began to make the noise that is associated with a picture being printed out. I failed to get the image in time when it fell onto the bed. In spite of this, Josh picked it up, and as he looked at it, the terror that was seen on his face was immediately apparent. He was horrified. I probed him to explain why he appeared to be so frightened. I got the image from him, and as soon as I glanced at it, I became paralyzed with horror as well. The window of this room was the location where the photograph was shot, and it was of us getting out of the cruiser. Was anyone in this room? Were we being watched or followed? Who could that person be? This was a terrifying situation for me. There was no one in the house to take a picture of us arriving, and I couldn't believe it was happening. In spite of this, the camera printed another photo while I was still deeply engrossed in my thoughts and pondering how it could possibly be possible. This time, it was a picture of Josh and I in the room that was decorated in the Victorian style, but it was slanted away from the wall. Although I could see the spiral stairs behind me in the corridor, that was not the thing that caused me to become paralyzed with panic. I was able to see a shadow crouching down in the corner of the short corridor behind the door. When I looked at the corner of the photo, it appeared to be looking at us. At the same time, as it was becoming more difficult to breathe, I showed Josh the picture. Another emotion was on his face, and to say that he was afraid would be an understatement. It was during this time that the camera produced yet another photograph. This time, it was a picture of us when we were in the dark room. Due to the presence of a figure in the corner of the room, I was able to envision the two of us exploring the space in the dark. I halted as I glanced at her countenance, which encompassed an evil grin that spread all the way through her cheeks. It was a woman clothed in vintage clothing from the Victorian era. Despite the fact that it was animalistic, we failed to notice it. Another photo was printed by the camera. This time, it showed the door to the third chamber opening and a woman stepping out of the room. We heard the door open just as the camera finishing printing this, and we immediately ran as we heard it. The only thing we did was run with all the strength we had. We did not look back. I opened the door to the car and sat down inside. I started the car and tossed the camera in the back as we rushed out of the block. I left the block as quickly as possible. It would appear that it was somewhere around 11 o'clock when we arrived at the quarters, and Josh was attempting to regain his composure. What we saw when we went inside the house was out of this world. When I thought about that woman and the barbaric grin that was on her face, I couldn't help but feel goosebumps. However, we decided to leave the images alone. On the other hand, the camera that I kept on my desk was the sole piece of evidence that we had. Josh exited the quarters as he gathered his belongings in preparation for his return to his home. Just like him, I was also terrified. On the other hand, as I was getting ready to leave, the camera developed a slight curvature as it printed the very last photo it would ever print. In addition, that particular aspect of this occurrence is something that I do not disclose to anyone else. I have kept it a secret from everyone. It was the final photograph that was printed, and it depicted Josh and I in the car as we sped away from the house. The same woman was sitting in the back seat, and she smiled in a cruel manner as we gazed ahead. This profession can be so scary and risky at the same time, yet most people love it. I don't think I love it, but what do you think about being a police officer? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. check out our previous video.